In this presentation, my goal is to spot issues pertinent to the application to healthcare of artificial intelligence, or as the AMA prefers to call it, augmented intelligence. I won't be hitting every point on every slide, partly because my goal in creating this deck was to make it a reference for you. So it's more detailed and extensive than my verbal remarks will be. I'm going to confine those to the points that I think are most important. And so I hope that you'll find the deck to be useful. If there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the panel discussion. Now, artificial intelligence is a concept that has been around for a long time, but its application to healthcare is relatively recent. This slide lists a handful of examples of uses to which this technology can be put in healthcare. It is by no means exhaustive, nor even remotely so. But as examples in diagnosis, artificial intelligence has been employed for the interpretation of mammograms, or even for the examination of faces in hopes of identifying genetic disorders more rapidly and more accurately. It's being used in treatment situations, such as determining the proper dose of insulin for brittle diabetics, for example. It's been used extensively and is in active use now for drug development and discovery. The pharmaceutical industry has invested in this heavily. And very pertinent currently, it's used for the monitoring of infectious diseases, such as the pneumonia cluster in Wuhan back at the end of 2020. This is the array of topics I hope to hit in this next 30 minutes or so. I'll turn first to the technology, and I'll issue this disclaimer. I am by no means an expert on the technology per se. In fact, I think I'm going to limit my discussion of the technology to two concepts that I think have legal significance, and that's the distinction between supervised and unsupervised machine learning. Machine learning is just what the name suggests. We actually teach a machine to learn. You give a computer thousands, or more likely millions, or even billions of images of dogs and billions of images of cats, and eventually it learns how to distinguish dogs from cats. So it's not exactly the way humans do it. An infant, well, at least a toddler, can do that intuitively, much more rapidly and much more easily. But these are machines, after all, not humans. The supervised machine learning concept involves exposing a computer. Take, for example, a large array of chemical compounds, and the humans programming this machine know which ones are drugs and which ones are not, and eventually teach the machine how to distinguish those that are pharmaceuticals from those that are not. And it can then, at least in theory, identify as a drug or not a drug an unknown compound to which it is exposed after this course of action takes place. Contrast that with unsupervised machine learning, in which there is no teacher, if you will. We leave the machine to its own devices to try to discover patterns among compounds, and eventually, with any luck, it will be able to become able to distinguish compounds with therapeutic potential from those that are not. What's significant about it, I think, legally, is that even the experts, even the people who built the system, devised the algorithms, do not know and cannot explain what happens in the process between presentation of the system with input and its eventual output. Whereas with supervised machine learning, at least in theory, we can do that. We'll see why that's significant in just a bit. Now, again, my goal here is just to spot issues. The first such that occurs to me is whether the use of AI could, in some circumstances, be considered a form of research on human subjects. And for this example, I'm going to go to Facebook. Now, I will hasten to say that I'm not here to criticize Facebook, or for that matter, anybody else. Still, it's an interesting model because it gives rise to an opportunity to examine potentially important legal issues. Several years ago, Facebook determined that it would attempt using information that its users post on its platform to identify those at risk for suicide. And by using human experts to train an AI system, it became possible for Facebook, at least in theory, to identify a post indicating that the person putting the information up might well be engaged in suicidal ideation, or maybe even at risk for actual suicide. So in an effort to try to prevent that from happening, when the AI system picked up that kind of information, it would send to the user information about the suicide prevention hotlines that are available around the United States. If the level of concern was even higher because of something that the user had said, then the Facebook would ask its users' Facebook friends to contact their friend and make sure that everything was okay. And then when the level of concern was at its highest, Facebook would actually contact EMS in the user's community and have an ambulance or a policeman or a fireman or somebody show up at the user's location to try to be sure that that individual was not about to do himself in. Is that research? Well, not superficially. It certainly doesn't resemble the fellow there with the microscope. On the other hand, it certainly is innovative, and it has taught its algorithms to ignore certain text in order to decipher those, identify those who really are potentially at risk for suicide. So when the disgruntled teenager comes home from school and goes on Facebook and says, "I have so much homework, I'm going to kill myself," the Facebook algorithm distinguishes that from genuine suicidal ideation. It took a lot of effort to get to that point, but Facebook won't tell us about how it got to the algorithm that it now employs. Why? Because it's proprietary. The details are not available. In general, if there's research, it's based on publications, or at least it results in publications. That's not about to happen with a for-profit enterprise such as Facebook. If it is engaged in some sort of research, is there some obligation to obtain informed consent? And by what mechanism would that be done, and by whom? What about records of results? Certainly we demand that of ordinary research on human subjects. Are we going to demand that of Facebook? I don't think that has been proposed in any serious fashion to date, but it is an interesting question. So if artificial intelligence could in some sense be used as a form of research, could it be accused or claimed that it is engaged in the practice of medicine? Well, I decided to quote the Virginia Code because Virginia is where I hang my hat. But I think you'll find, if you look at the definition of the practice of medicine in most states, at least those that I've come across, ordinarily, as in Virginia, the definition is pretty broad and encompasses a wide array of activities. Now, Facebook acquires personal information about an individual by simply reading what that individual chooses to post about himself or about others. Then it evaluates the significance of that information. It offers advice and support, and it even decides whether to activate the healthcare system. Could that be construed as the practice of medicine? So far as I know, the law doesn't answer that question at present. But if it is medical practice, does that mean that AI somehow has to be licensed? And if so, in what jurisdiction, or jurisdictions plural? What happens if the AI supplants the judgment of the physician? Well, as we'll see, that has legal significance as well, if indeed that ever happens. But I would suggest that it's not an entirely silly question to ask whether AI could potentially be practicing medicine. And if it is, what do we do with the laws that govern the practice of medicine as they stand today? And if, in fact, it could potentially be thought, entertained, that indeed AI, it could be some form of healthcare practice when it's used in healthcare, what about other healthcare disciplines? Could it be engaged in the practice of nursing? Could it be engaged in the practice of psychology? Or fill in the blank with other possibilities. Again, I chose Virginia just because it's easy for me to do, but like here, most states define the practice of nursing and indeed other disciplines in healthcare rather broadly. I assume it's because they want, the state wants the Board of Medicine, the Board of Nursing, et cetera, to have sufficient scope, sufficient sway to be able to make sure that the health of the public is protected. Whatever the rationale, the definition is pretty broad, and I don't think it's crazy to ask, could indeed it be extended to encompass the concept of AI in healthcare? By the way, in this presentation, if I'm referring to physicians, it's simply convenience. Most of these points apply to just about any branch of the learned healthcare professions, and I just use doctors and physicians for shorthand. Let's turn to negligence. I won't go into this as much detail as I might have because I believe that later this afternoon, Dr. Zhao is going to devote a whole talk to this. But the first question, of course, is whether there exists a duty. Now, in many states, there's a concept that if there's a consultant who does not himself interact with the patient, but only with that patient's doctor, then the consultant owes no duty to the patient. The consulting physician does, the referring physician does, but not the consultants. Well, what is the role of artificial intelligence? Does it, when it is consulted by a doctor or any other health professional, does it resemble a consultant in the traditional sense, or is it more like a machine? Is it more like an MRI or a PET scanner or something? We don't really know the answer to that, but that answer may have an impact upon whether, in some sense, AI could be held to have a duty to a patient. Well, if it does, what is that duty? What is the standard of care? Well, in traditional medical legal thinking, one looks to the practice, the habit, the custom of practitioners within the discipline. And the requirement of the law is that such a person act in a reasonable manner. Well, what is reasonable for AI? Can one argue that AI is invulnerable to lawsuits because by definition it's not capable of any behavior that is not reasonable? It is, after all, nothing but computer logic. How could that be unreasonable? If we have a doctor who's using AI in the care of patients, is the standard of care for him higher than it is for someone who's not? Is there a defense to a claim of malpractice if the doctor can say, well, I relied upon AI, therefore I've certainly at least complied, if not exceeded, what's required by the standard of care? Suppose something goes wrong. Would res ipsa loquitur apply here? I point to this Nelson case from California, where unfortunately an airline on automatic pilot crashed into a mountain, killing everybody on board, leading, of course, to litigation. Well, the court concluded that because the plane was being flown by autopilot, and assuming autopilots are done properly, presumably they don't crash planes into mountains, that res ipsa was indeed an applicable theory there. Would that apply to artificial intelligence? I don't think we know. In the law of tort, certainly, foreseeability is crucial. The law expects actors to take steps to reduce the risk of foreseeable harms. Remember my distinction early on between supervised and unsupervised machine learning. By definition, is unsupervised machine learning invulnerable to liability because its results, its conclusions are unforeseeable. After all, nobody knows, including the experts, what happens inside the black box. Is that a defense? We'll have to see. What about healthcare professionals and institutions that have promoted AI in a variety of settings? A good example is robotic surgery. Lots of hospitals now offer this. These systems are typically very expensive. I wouldn't be flabbergasted if at least some folks at a hospital invested in such a system weren't actively seeking opportunities to use it to justify the cost and achieve a certain ROI. Well, suppose something goes wrong and your practice is at a facility that has been promoting this type of technology and its use in healthcare. Is your exposure greater as a result of that than it would be otherwise? At the very least, I would be surprised if our friends on the other side of the V for me, the plaintiffs' bar, weren't willing to run that up the flagpole. What about failing to use it? I mean, after all, the standard of care changes as learning changes, as science and the practice of medicine improve over time. May there come a point at which the failure to deploy this technology is itself a breach of the standard of care? I don't think we have a case that says that. And if we do, it may be years before that occurs. But again, I wouldn't be surprised to see that theory. If indeed it's possible to assert some sort of claim against an artificial intelligence system or the people who own it or the people who design it, who are the appropriate experts? There have been at least a couple of cases in which it's been examined, in which physicians, presumably otherwise highly qualified to serve as experts and able to help the jury with its decision-making, were excluded by the court on the basis not that they had lack of clinical expertise, but because they didn't have sufficient sophistication about the software or the programming. Now, that New Jersey course was reversed on appeal. Nevertheless, it does raise an interesting question. How do you qualify an expert to testify in these cases? What about the law of agency? Always important in malpractice, always important in tort generally. When is A liable for the behavior of B? Well, I think the answer to that in this context may go back to that distinction I tried to raise earlier. Is AI more like a consultant, more like a human, or more like a machine? And if somehow the AI that Dr. Jones decides to use is Dr. Jones's agent, if I'm on the other side, I argue, well, the AI can't possibly be an agent because there isn't any possibility for consensual relationship between the purported principal and the purported agent, as there is in real agency situations. After all, it's not as if the AI can negotiate the scope of the authorization or dissolve the agent-patient relationship and so forth, as a human agent actually could. Still, again, I expect to see that theory someday. And whom does one sue? Well, I'm a defense type, so my answer is nobody. But I tried to think about all the possible targets. I'm quite certain this list, is, as long as it is not complete. And plaintiffs' counsel, who are nothing if not creative, inventive, and ingenious, will come up with other possibilities that have not occurred to me. Now, it takes money to develop the algorithms, to develop artificial intelligence and apply it in healthcare. Not infrequently, the sources of those funds are pharmaceutical houses, medical device companies, et cetera. There's not a thing wrong with that. They've made some major contributions, in fact, over the years. But is it at least possible to entertain the thought that if a pharmaceutical company has supported the development of AI for the management of problem X, that it might perhaps, however subtly, suggest that for most patients with problem X, the solution, the right approach therapeutically, is the drug made by that particular company. Again, I'm not here to suggest that has ever happened. I have no evidence that it ever did. Is that a theory that might be asserted? I wouldn't be surprised. What about informed consent? Now, this time outside the research context. Lots of thorny questions here if we're going to use AI in the care of a patient. Does the doctor seeking consent have to know enough about AI to explain how it works, especially if he's using a black box system? What about the AI system itself? Well, when I use my dog and cat example, the sets of all these pictures that were exposed to the system, it's called the training set. Well, what if the training set is not necessarily reflective in the human context of the demographics of a particular population? Does the practitioner wishing to employ informed consent need to discuss that with his patient in order for consent to be informed, assuming the consent is necessary in the first place? What about such things as predictive accuracy and error rates, especially in this nascent period when for much of AI, we really don't have the data on that? Are we supposed to, in obtaining informed consent, make a comparison between results with AI and results without it? Once again, we probably don't have data sufficient to make confident statements about that. Does that mean that consent is not possible? Does that mean that that consent lacking that information is insufficient legally? We're going to have to see. We thought about negligence. What about product liability? After you're using gadgets here, you're using lots of fancy devices. This is simply a quotation of the restatement second on strict liability. I won't read it. I'm sure many of you, most of you probably are familiar with it. Up to this point, to the best of my ability to research the question, however, AI has generally not been held to strict liability. Why? Because up to this point, AI has been analogized not to products, but to services. This Rogers case from the Third Circuit in 2020 examined, interestingly enough, an algorithm not in a healthcare context, but rather in making an assessment about a criminal defendant and the likelihood that he could be safely released pending trial. The things did not go well. A lawsuit was brought. The court concluded that because it was a judge and not the machine that actually made the decision for pretrial release, then we were not going to apply strict liability concepts. We were not dealing with a product. We were dealing with a service, and ordinary negligence principles would apply. Is that always going to be the case in the future? We'll have to see. Again, I tried to think about potential parties defended. The list is not quite as long as perhaps as it would be for the negligence context. Still, quite a few targets here. It's what the military would call, I think, a target-rich environment. And this is just from the standpoint of a defense type. The plaintiff's bar would no doubt come up with more creativity than I. What about suing AI itself? And I thought about robots, often used in surgery and sometimes in other contexts. That may strike you as silly, but there was a time, if you remember back to legal history, when the idea of a corporation was itself at least doubtful, and the possibility that it could be a party to litigation was seen as far-fetched. Well, we know where that went. And also, even at common law, one can sue a ship. A vessel can be arrested or seized or sold. And interestingly, in Europe, just a few years ago, there was a serious proposal that Europe recognized something it called electronic persons. And eventually that decision was tabled, but the idea was that a robot could in some sense be an electronic person and therefore presumably sue and be sued. All right, we've considered research. We've asked whether we could potentially be practicing some branch of healthcare. We've considered negligence, exposure, product liability. What about privacy? Well, remember, artificial intelligence, for its efficacy, depends upon enormous amounts of data. To distinguish the dog from the cat, we don't need thousands of pictures. We don't need millions. We typically need billions, an awful lot of information. It's called big data for a reason. Amazon went to the National Health Service some years back in Britain to offer Alexa in aid of some of the services that the NHS provided and promised that there would be no sharing of patient data. It was alleged soon thereafter that despite that promise, in fact, sharing occurred. Note that, at least so far as I've been able to determine, in most jurisdictions, in fact, perhaps all, there doesn't seem to be much on the way of legal authority governing the length of time that a private entity offering AI services needs to or is permitted to hold on to the kinds of information entrusted to it. To go back to my Facebook example, in the Suicide Prevention Service, despite its good intentions, there wasn't any opt-in opportunity nor an opt-out opportunity. And again, I'm not here to criticize anybody, but after all, Facebook makes its money by targeting ads. If in monitoring my statements about my clinical depression, it concludes that maybe I'm at risk for suicide, is it possible that on the basis of that inference, it might send me ads that are valued more highly by the advertiser because they are coming not to Mr. X, Ms. Y, but they're coming to me specifically? I don't know. Think about this. The 800-pound of medical privacy in America is HIPAA, but HIPAA probably doesn't apply. Why? Well, the AI system is not a covered entity. There are only 3 types of covered entities, and AI doesn't count. It's probably not a business associate either. If it's neither a covered entity nor a business associate, to what then does HIPAA apply? COPPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It protects privacy of kids online, but only those under 13. If we have anybody older than that, COPPA doesn't do you much good. And I'll again turn to Virginia, my own state. Virginia recently enacted what it called the Consumer Data Protection Act. It was consciously modeled after the California statutes that have themselves been modeled after the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which by most American standards is especially robust with respect to its protection of privacy. But in Virginia, and I think also in 1 or 2 other American states that have adopted more aggressive approaches to privacy, there's no private right of action. That doesn't mean that these statutes are without teeth. It does mean, however, that one otherwise available form of enforcement is not available to us. In this context, it might be wise to reflect briefly on the third-party doctrine, which under Smith against Maryland says that a person has no legitimate expectation of privacy in information he voluntarily turns over to third parties. In that case, it involved a pen register. Now, Justice Sotomayor questioned that in a 2012 decision. It's not clear whether this doctrine applies to social media, to bank records, etc., but it's even clearer, even more unclear, whether it would apply to AI. If AI is being used in my care, do I have a legitimate expectation of privacy or do I not? We'll have to see. Won't spend any time on this, but Dogbert is telling Dilbert that because Dilbert's records are in the cloud, he doesn't have a single diagnosis, he now has 6. So we've considered several topics. Let's turn briefly to reimbursement. Most third-party payers, notably including Medicare, reimburse only for that care which is medically necessary, quote unquote, and not for experimental treatments or devices. Well, is AI therapy or AI diagnostic modalities, are they medically necessary or are they experimental? I don't think the jury's back on that question either. To the extent that third-party governmental reimbursement may be possible, it is perhaps prudent to remember how long it took for telehealth to begin to develop some reasonable level of reimbursement. Not only did it take more than 20 years, it also took a global pandemic. Now, to its credit, at least by my lights, CMS, as long ago as 2018, pointed to what it perceived as unnecessary gaps between FDA approval of a given technology and Medicare's willingness to pay for it, and vowed to try to do something about that by making its coverage decisions more transparent, among other things. The government created a system to assess how effective AI could be in healthcare, by creating something called the Artificial Intelligence Health Outcomes Challenge. And it was intended to assess how well AI can predict unplanned hospitalizations, SNF admissions, and adverse events. Unfortunately, COVID came along, and this has now been put on the back burner. AI can also be used, and is being used, to review coding decisions. We can train AI to maximize reimbursable services, or we can train it to look for billing practices that are, from the standpoint of the payer, debatable. We'll see that in just a minute, but this is a tool that could be used then either to look for ways to enhance reimbursement or ways to contain it. And by the way, before I move on to the next slide, those of you familiar with the famous Henrietta Lacks story at Hopkins and the cells that she contributed to the advancement of science, their family is seeking compensation. If we use patient data in AI to discover something, do the patients from whom the tissue came, are they entitled to some sort of payment? For the first time in history, a little more than a year ago, CMS did pay for artificial intelligence in healthcare. This, to my knowledge, at least, this is the first example. A company called Viz.ai had developed AI that was intended to help in the diagnosis of strokes. and it was able to persuade CMS that it should add a little over $1,000 to the standard repayment for hospitalization for stroke management. Now, critics have attacked this decision on the basis that Viz.ai sold this concept to CMS on the basis of a study of only 43 patients. And some would question whether that's adequate documentation to support the utility and cost effectiveness of this approach. Other critics have pointed to the example of screening mammograms. I yield to Dr. Wall on this topic. I don't pretend to know much about it. But there are those who allege, at least, that we have invested enormous sums of money in expanding access to these mammograms without any substantial improvement in outcomes. Whether that claim is true, I don't pretend to know, but I could at least imagine analogous criticisms being made if AI is paid for in a big way in the near future. Now, I mentioned that it's possible to manipulate AI to enhance reimbursement. The best example I can give of this is this slide. We have here a view of the funds of a given individual, and I'm not good enough, particularly now that I'm 35 years removed from clinical care, to be able to tell you, but those who are say that the image on the left is so unlikely for diabetic retinopathy that one can pretty much dismiss it as a threat to that patient. But by adding something that the technological people call adversarial noise, which consists of tinkering with the original image in a manner undetectable by the human eye, even the trained human eye, one can produce a distortion of the original image that on the score of diabetic retinopathy has gone from almost nothing to almost certainty. And of course, if indeed diabetic retinopathy is demonstrated and has to be managed, the reimbursement is likely to be enriched. We'll talk briefly about regulation. And again, this is a chapter whose conclusion has not yet been written. Most would say that the most logical agency for regulating AI in healthcare would be FDA, which philosophically attempts to make the degree of regulation proportionate to what it perceives as the risk. A key question in FDA analysis is, what is the intended use of your drug or of your device? Are black box algorithms medical devices? We don't really know the answer to that yet, but the definition is rather broad, much like, for example, the practice of medicine. What does seem clear is that FDA is going to more heavily regulate that AI system, which, at least in theory, governs the decision for diagnosis or treatment or both of the patient more heavily, more strictly than that AI system, which merely augments the doctor's ability to, again, to parrot the AMA, augmented intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence. The 21st Century Cures Act was a statute Congress passed a couple of years ago that took some types of software outside FDA authority, including some used for clinical decision support. Sorry, that's what CDS stands for. Under the Act, clinical decision support is exempt if all it does is display or analyze medical information, or it makes recommendations to providers about care, but those providers can independently review the basis for those recommendations and make their own judgments. When you have an AI system that does nothing more than that, says Congress through the 21st Century Cures Act, we're going to let that alone and regulate it very little, if at all. FDA has also done some things to try to accommodate the fact that this technology is exploding. It's growing at a rapid rate, and it is literally impossible to predict what's going to happen as any given algorithm evolves over time. So it created what it calls the pre-certification program for those companies that it believes have a cultural quality and organizational excellence. They're going to be treated specially in that they will not need to notify FDA and get its okay for every single modification of an algorithm. Instead, they're going to be required to engage in heavy post-market data collection and to share those data with the agency so they can make decisions after the fact. FDA also came out with a new way of getting a product to the market, de novo pre-market review. Those of you familiar with 510K principles and getting devices to market know that the promoter, the sponsor of the product, needs to demonstrate that there is a predicate device, a device already lawfully on the market to which its device is, magic phrases, substantially equivalent. Well, it's hard to do that if you've got a brand new technology like AI. So now this de novo arrangement is a way for developers of these products to get their products on the market more easily, more quickly. critics of FDA turn around and say, you guys are not allowed to regulate the practice of medicine, and that's what you're doing. Or that medical algorithms are a form of commercial speech and therefore enjoy a measure of protection under the First Amendment, and FDA has no business under the Constitution trying to regulate what those who develop AI bring to the market. It's squashing speech and therefore unconstitutional. This I will spend very little time on it. It's just intended to show that the rate at which FDA is approving AI and machine learning enabled devices is growing at a rapid rate. That's by no means an exhaustive list of all the issues one could think about. High on the list, but one that I'm not at all competent to address, is intellectual property. A very intriguing question is whether an AI system can itself hold a patent. Under US law, to the best of my understanding to the present time, the answer to that is an emphatic no. But interestingly, in other countries that have a patent system somewhat different from ours, the opposite conclusion has been reached. In Australia and South Africa, for example, it is apparently possible for artificial intelligence to be an inventor and to hold a patent. Bias I already mentioned, but as an example, AI systems do much better at diagnosing melanoma in folks with light-colored skin than they do in people with dark-colored skin. Corporate practice issues, who owns the data, antitrust, and then the very intriguing question of professional unemployment. Will there come a day when dermatologists will be out of business because machines are going to be interpreting skin lesions? I think the answer is no, but that concern has been raised. Finally, a few slides on the use of AI in the law. On the civil side of things, AI is being promoted and in a few cases used to identify suitable jurors, to speed up legal research, to predict judicial outcomes, and to facilitate e-discovery. In criminal law, at the moment, there are more than 60 automated systems in various stages of adoption, mostly used for things like post-trial sentencing and whether to offer bail, and if so, in what amounts. There's a product from LexisNexis that claims that it can analyze judge profiles and predict trends in judgment, as an example of applications of artificial intelligence in the law. There's a COMPAS, is the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, quite a mouthful, used in sentencing of a judge. In a case called State against Loomis from Wisconsin in 2016, the defense counsel tried to challenge the use of COMPAS, and in particular tried to discover more about the algorithm and how it led to whatever conclusion it finally reached. But the trial court held that the defense counsel was not entitled to this information because it was protected as a trade secret, and that decision was upheld on appeal. Algorithms are being used to predict the risk that a defendant released into society will pose a threat or not. Unfortunately, because of a data entry error by a human, a judge relying on an AI system released a defendant who committed murder upon his release. There's a story about it in Law 360. I've already mentioned bias. There have been papers that have demonstrated, for example, or at least have claimed, that facial recognition algorithms used by police are more likely to create false positive results for black folks than they are for white. And yet the ACLU, which can hardly be accused of excessive conservatism, says that there's a risk assessment algorithm that it promotes because it resulted in a 20% reduction in the number of people incarcerated while awaiting trial. With both the medicine and the law, then the jury is still out. We'll have to see. But I am myself, at least, fascinated by the array of issues posed by this form of technology, and I hope you will find this useful as well. Behind this slide are about a half a dozen of various references of publications that you may find useful, as I did. Thank you very much for your time.